Mark Wahlberg confronts a rude talk show host. His response leaves the audience speechless. Mark Wahlberg arrived at the studio with the kind of quiet confidence he had honed over years in the entertainment industry, stepping out of a sleek black SUV and into the brisk evening air, where a row of gleaming lights illuminated the path leading to the studio's backstage entrance, each glowing bulb seeming to mirror the anticipation thrumming through his veins. He had done talk shows 100 times before, but tonight felt oddly charged, perhaps because rumors swirled that this particular host, known for his biting wit and combative style, had taken a special interest in testing Mark's patience. As he walked through the bustling corridors, a cacophony of voices, footsteps, and distant stage music echoed off the walls, heightening the sense that something was about to erupt in front of the live studio audience. Ever the professional, Mark greeted the staff warmly, signing a few autographs and chatting briefly with a young production assistant who timidly asked him about his upcoming film, carefully avoiding any mention of the host's notoriously brash demeanor. Inside his dressing room, large mirrors framed by bright bulbs cast a harsh glow on Mark's reflection, amplifying every detail of his features, including a faint line of worry etched between his brows. He took a deep breath, feeling the subtle adrenaline spike that always came before stepping on stage. Yet this time it felt more urgent, like the tension before a storm, as if some unspoken pressure weighed heavily on his shoulders. Thoughts flickered through his mind about his family, his upbringing, and the media narrative that had trailed him for years, reminding him that any host worth their salt could easily weaponize his past. He sipped water from a paper cup, eyes drifting to the clock on the wall, realizing that in mere minutes he'd be walking onto a set that many considered a gladiatorial arena of words, where the host thrived on provocation. While Mark was no stranger to blunt questions, he sensed that tonight might demand an extra layer of poise and composure, especially if he intended to leave this interview with his dignity intact. The moment a stagehand gently knocked on his door to escort him out, his heart rate quickened, but he steeled himself, determined to keep his cool no matter what got thrown his way. Just beyond the curtain, the roar of the crowd greeted him, a thunderous wave of applause rolling through the auditorium as the announcer introduced him with enthusiastic fanfare. Before he emerged into the bright lights, he stole one last calming breath, visualizing a scenario where he graciously deflected the host's jabs and kept the conversation focused on the positives, like his philanthropic work or upcoming movie roles. The set itself glowed in vibrant hues, cameras pivoting on their mechanical arms to capture every angle, and seated behind a sleek wooden desk was the host, wearing a half-smirk that hinted at equal parts charm and menace. Mark stepped onto the stage, greeted by an electrified wave of cheers, and crossed the distance with measured strides, shaking the host's hand in a gesture that felt colder than it looked. There was a certain rigidity in the host's posture, an unspoken challenge in the way he locked eyes with Mark, neither looking away nor offering a genuine smile. Though the audience remained excited, clapping wildly, a few people in the front row exchanged anxious glances, perhaps noticing the absence of any genuine warmth between the two men on stage. Still, Mark offered a polite grin, setting himself down on the plush guest chair, crossing one leg over the other to present an air of relaxed confidence that belied the tension simmering in the room. The host initiated small talk, about the weather, about the city's traffic, an obligatory routine that felt more like a strategic lull before launching into heavier topics, and Mark responded with just enough politeness to keep things cordial. The bright stage lights beat down, warming Mark's forehead, yet he kept his gaze steady on the host, unconsciously bracing for a verbal jab that would undoubtedly come. Sure enough, the host's first pointed question about Mark's early career carried a veiled sneer, referencing controversies that were decades old, delivered with a honeyed tone that made it sound innocent to anyone who didn't catch the undertone. In that moment, Mark felt his shoulders tense, recalling painful chapters of his youth, but he replied steadily, calmly acknowledging that everyone grows from their mistakes and that he had worked hard to become a better version of himself. The air practically crackled with expectation, as if the audience sensed that each subsequent question would push Mark closer to a breaking point. Yet he continued to maintain his composure, each response carefully measured to ensure he did not feed the host's thirst for drama. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion crossing Mark's face, every twitch of the host's lips as he angled for the next sensational soundbite, the tension thickening with each exchange. Mark caught sight of the stage manager near the sidelines, who looked uneasy, sensing that the interview was quickly straying from the standard promotional chat for a new movie and edging into dangerous territory. Despite the potential for confrontation, Mark refused to be intimidated, reminded himself of the bigger picture, and decided he would not allow the host to spin a salacious narrative without hearing his truth. He wove in anecdotes about his transformation, referencing the family and faith that grounded him, shining a gentle spotlight on the positive changes in his life while still acknowledging he was not without flaws. A subtle wave of respect rippled through certain sections of the audience at Mark's honesty, especially when he hinted at how personal accountability and taking responsibility for past actions had shaped him. But the host appeared unsatisfied, like a predator disappointed his prey wasn't bleeding enough. His carefully manicured fingers tapping against the desk, eyes gleaming with the prospect of a more heated confrontation. Between questions, Mark took another calming breath, feeling the dryness of his mouth and the faint pounding of blood in his ears, a signal that he was well aware of how thin the ice beneath them was becoming. Over the host's shoulder, Mark could see a monitor reflecting both their faces, side by side, and it struck him how the host's expression never really softened, constantly scanning for a moment to pounce. The conversation drifted toward Mark's early projects, where the host selectively quoted critics who had once doubted Mark's acting range, painting them in the most unflattering light possible. Although Mark wanted to roll his eyes, he held them steady, respectfully countering that such critiques had motivated him to hone his craft, resulting in the versatile career that he was proud of today. A smattering of applause floated up from the audience, underscoring the fact that, despite the host's efforts, many people admired Mark's journey and recognized his growth over the years. Sensing that Mark's composure wasn't cracking just yet, the host pivoted again, this time asking about Mark's personal life in a tone that implied he was fishing for embarrassing tidbits. Mark gave a measured chuckle, deflecting with polite answers about cherishing private time with his loved ones, subtly warning the host that there were lines he wouldn't cross. A hush fell over the studio as the audience sensed the precarious balance, enthralled by the dance of politeness and tension playing out under the harsh glare of the spotlight. 2 seats down, an older audience member whispered something to her companion, likely remarking on Mark's remarkable restraint, while the cameras continued their silent surveillance. The host leaned forward, eyes narrowed, determined to break through the veneer of calm, and posed a rhetorical query about whether Mark believed his success was purely the result of luck. Carefully tamping down a flicker of annoyance, Mark responded that hard work, perseverance, and a desire to better himself had all been critical factors. The host scoffed, his well-crafted veneer slipping for a second, and Mark, recognizing the hostility beneath the surface, finally acknowledged inwardly that it was only a matter of time before a real confrontation would spark. Yet for the duration of that first segment, Mark managed to keep the peace, employing a measured, almost diplomatic tone that left the crowd wondering just how far this standoff could escalate. When the show cut to its first commercial break, Mark exhaled slowly, his eyes momentarily drifting across the set to see if the host would break character off air. But the man stayed rigid, offering a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. The band played a short interlude, and the audience clapped out of habit. But the energy in the room felt thick with anticipation for what might unfold once the cameras returned. Mark leaned back in his seat, bracing himself for the coming segments, fully aware that this was just the calm before a brewing storm that would put his patience and his character to a harsh public test. Everyone, from the camera operators to the makeup crew, seemed to realize that they were on the verge of witnessing a talk show interview that would not be easily forgotten. As the stage manager signaled the end of the commercial break, Mark straightened in his chair, recalibrating his mental focus, determined not to let the host drag him into unnecessary drama. The lights brightened again, the announcer boomed a welcome back, and the audience settled, eyes glued to Mark and the host, fully aware that the real show was about to begin in earnest. The second segment kicked off with a pointed jab from the host, who, rather than easing back into the conversation with small talk, launched directly into a critique of Mark's latest project. his voice dripping with a dismissive tone that sent a ripple of unease through the studio. Mark felt a subtle rush of heat spread across his cheeks, but he steadied himself, refusing to give the host the satisfaction of a visible reaction. The audience, sensing a sharp shift in the host's demeanor, exchanged hushed murmurs, with some leaning forward in their seats as though bracing for a verbal sparring match. Cameras zoomed in tighter, capturing each micro-expression on Mark's face, while the band fell silent, as if even they sensed this was no moment for light-hearted music. The host pressed on, dissecting Mark's role in the film with an almost surgical precision, twisting facts and sprinkling in half-truths designed to poke holes in Mark's credibility. Although Mark tried to interject with a calm defense, the host cut him off mid-sentence, effectively silencing him with a smug half-smile that bordered on contempt. In the control room, producers exchanged worried glances, well aware that a tense confrontation might mean higher ratings, but could also lead to chaos if it spiraled out of control. Oblivious or simply unconcerned, the host continued, his voice growing louder, his questions laced with a peculiar mix of forced politeness and barely veiled aggression. Mark drew a sharp breath, reminding himself of his earlier resolve to remain calm. Yet he felt the first real flicker of anger stir in his stomach, a slow burn that threatened to erupt if he wasn't careful. Off to the side, the stage manager discreetly signaled for the cameras to keep rolling, as an undercurrent of both dread and excitement swept through the entire production team. With every new inquiry, the host delved deeper into Mark's personal history, dredging up old controversies, brandishing them like weapons, and insinuating that Mark had been given far too many chances in life. Each time Mark tried to clarify, the host would barely let him finish a sentence before lobbing another loaded question, a strategy that kept Mark perpetually off balance. The audience seemed torn between empathy for Mark's predicament and a morbid fascination with the host's gall, their applause intermittent, almost hesitant, as they watched the tense exchange unfold. Mark forced himself to focus on measured breathing, recalling how important it was to present the truth without descending into an ugly argument that would dominate the tabloids the next day. Yet the host's relentless tone grew sharper still, veering into ad hominem territory as he began to question Mark's integrity, suggesting that the star's carefully crafted public persona might be little more than a marketing ploy. A faint tremor of incredulity coursed through Mark, who hadn't expected such a personal attack at this stage, even from a host reputed to poke and prod at vulnerabilities. He glanced at the teleprompter, which listed a few remaining segments and topics, recognizing with mounting dismay that the interview was nowhere near finished and that more landmines likely lay ahead. A sense of creeping frustration took root, yet Mark remained outwardly composed, drawing on his experience in front of cameras to project a calm confidence that belied the storm brewing within him. He tried to steer the conversation back to the film, praising the hard-working cast and crew, attempting to redirect attention to the artistry and effort behind the production rather than the host's sensational line of questioning. However, the host refused to loosen his grip, twisting Mark's words and insinuating that he was desperate to change the subject because he had something to hide. The collective tension in the studio rose to a near-palpable level, thickening the air to the point that even the subtle shuffle of an audience member's shoes seemed thunderous. One of the show's camera operators, eyes wide, panned across the audience, capturing the rapt faces of people on the edge of their seats, fully aware that something explosive was about to happen. With each jab, the host's hostility became more overt, his demeanor shifting from the typical talk show banter to something more predatory, zeroing in on Mark like a hawk circling its prey. Mark took another deep breath, blinking to clear the heat from his eyes, and managed to deliver a polite but firm reminder that he was there to discuss his work, not to engage in petty debates over his personal life. This only seemed to fuel the host's aggravation, as he leaned across his desk, emphasizing every syllable of his next question in a manner designed to provoke. His gaze, fixed on Mark, carried a challenge, a silent dare for Mark to break, to snap under pressure and give the show the kind of sensational meltdown that would trend instantly. A hush settled over the audience as Mark paused, mouth slightly open as he considered how best to respond without igniting a full-on altercation that could overshadow everything he had accomplished over the years. The faint rustle of cue cards behind the camera reminded him that time was ticking, that this interview would soon be a matter of public record, dissected by viewers and critics alike. Swallowing back the urge to lash out, Mark let his expression soften, acknowledging the host's pointed remarks without validating them, delicately challenging each accusation with facts the host conveniently ignored. This strategy of calm rebuttal only seemed to rile the host further, his voice climbing another octave, sounding more like a prosecutor interrogating a defendant than a talk show host conversing with a guest. Through it all, the audience remained riveted, some members growing visibly uncomfortable with the host's aggression, others silently urging Mark to push back and stand his ground. Even the stage's vibrant lighting, originally set to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere, seemed to glare harshly now, illuminating the tension etched across both men's faces. Mark could practically feel the sweat beating at the nape of his neck, his pulse quickening each time the host unleashed another barrage of insinuations regarding his character, his motivations, and even his parenting. The conversation ventured into territory that felt unprofessional for a primetime show, and Mark had to consciously unclench his jaw to keep from snapping, aware that the faintest sign of true anger might be all the host needed to pounce triumphantly. Nevertheless, the repeated onslaught began to wear on Mark's patience, chipping away at the protective wall of composure he had built up, grain by grain. Through clenched teeth, he managed to reiterate his position on accountability and personal growth, reminding the host and the viewers that he wasn't the same person he had been years ago. A mocking laugh escaped the host's lips, and Mark saw red for a split second, momentarily losing his focus as the words, "Oh, really?" cut through the air like a razor. The crowd gasped softly, sensing a turning point as Mark's eyes hardened, and for one taut moment, it seemed certain that the interview would erupt into a full-blown confrontation right then and there. Instead, Mark drew another measured breath, letting the moment linger, forcing the host and everyone watching to notice the unwavering control he still maintained, despite the relentless hostility aimed his way. By the time the host turned to his next set of cue cards, eyes gleaming with anticipation, the audience had collectively leaned forward, captivated by the tension, unsure of whether Mark's resolve would hold or finally crack under pressure. The tension inside the studio reached a fever pitch after the host's last round of intrusive questions, and as the show returned from a brief commercial break, every camera swung into position, capturing the electric suspense that hung thick in the air. Mark sat up straighter in his chair, aware of the simmering frustration coursing through him, yet determined to keep his composure for as long as humanly possible. With a practiced air of arrogance, the host shuffled a stack of cue cards, pausing for effect before asking an overtly personal question about Mark's upbringing, pointedly referencing painful events from Mark's adolescence in a way that felt both exploitative and cruel. A startled hush fell over the crowd, several audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they were about to witness a typical Hollywood feud or something far more profound and deeply personal. Mark's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the stage manager, who was fidgeting by the edge of the set, trying to keep the production on schedule without daring to intervene in the storm that was so clearly brewing. Deciding that the moment had arrived where turning the other cheek no longer served him or his message, Mark inhaled slowly, fixing the host with a calm but piercing gaze, silently letting him know that the casual disrespect was about to be challenged. The audience, sensing a shift in the energy, drew closer to the edge of their seats, eyes darting between the two men like spectators at a high-stakes tennis match, waiting to see who would flinch first. The host leaned forward with a smug grin, clearly savoring the moment, as if he believed he had finally cornered his guest into a response that would light up social media and send the show's ratings skyrocketing. Mark, refusing to avert his eyes, began to speak in a measured tone, choosing his words carefully and describing how difficult those early years had been, how he had made mistakes, paid the price, and worked tirelessly to transcend the limitations of his past. This acknowledgement of his human flaws initially sparked a flicker of empathy in the room, but the host cut him off abruptly, scoffing as though Mark's willingness to reflect was nothing but a calculated PR stunt. A few people in the audience gasped at the host's audacity, and whispers rippled through the crowd, with a middle-aged woman near the front shaking her head in clear disapproval of his rude behavior. Mark's voice wavered for a fraction of a second as he steadied himself against the rising heat in his chest, that age-old flush of anger threatening to break his restraint. The host seized on that brief moment of emotion, pressing in deeper, dredging up rumors and half-remembered anecdotes that painted Mark's teen years in the worst possible light, refusing to acknowledge the story of redemption Mark had painstakingly spent years building. A sudden wave of indignation swept through the audience. People could see the interview shifting from tough questioning to something bordering on harassment, and it was becoming uncomfortable to watch. Mark's eyes narrowed, and he firmly restated the facts, clarifying the mistakes of his past while emphasizing the tangible steps he had taken to change and create a positive impact in his career and personal life. Despite his best efforts to maintain control, the tension in his voice was evident now, and the host latched onto it like a shark sensing blood in the water, goading Mark to tell the truth as if he hadn't already done so. The camera panned across the set, capturing the silent drama unfolding. The flash of defiance in Mark's eyes, the predatory grin stretching across the host's face, and the hushed anxiety emanating from onlookers who felt a confrontation was mere seconds away. The spotlight seemed to burn brighter, as though amplifying every ounce of strain building between the two men, pushing them closer to a dangerous line that, once crossed, no amount of rehearsed politeness could mask. Leaning back in his chair with deliberate slowness, Mark swallowed once, reflecting on how easily he could lose his composure if he allowed his anger to rise unchecked, aware that the host wanted exactly that volatile reaction. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a subdued tremor that betrayed the depth of his agitation. Yet there was an undercurrent of resolute calm that caught everyone by surprise. He looked the host directly in the eye and questioned whether this line of interrogation was about serving the public's interest or simply feeding off spectacle, calling attention to the blatantly unfair way his past was being weaponized for ratings. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, and the host's smirk faltered for the briefest instant, a flash of irritation crossing his features as he realized Mark was turning the spotlight back on him. Attempting to regain control, the host raised his voice, insisting that it was his job to ask tough questions, shifting blame onto Mark for being too sensitive and accusing him of shying away from accountability. That thinly veiled contemptual barb hit a raw nerve, and Mark exhaled audibly, pressing his palms against his knees in an effort to anchor himself. The audience stared intently as Mark's eyes flicked to the production crew, many of whom looked torn between letting this spectacle continue for the sake of ratings and intervening to protect their guest from further abuse. Sensing the moral high ground slipping from his grip, the host tossed another incendiary remark, this time casting doubt on Mark's charitable endeavors, implying they were nothing more than a branding exercise to gloss over a checkered past. The accusation was so pointed and so insulting that an audible groan rose from the crowd, and someone in the back shouted that it was going too far, their voice echoing briefly before dying under the stage lights. Mark's composure cracked just slightly, the muscles in his neck tensing as he leaned forward, and for a heartbeat, it looked as though he might stand up and physically storm off the set. Instead, he gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening, and gathered the courage to speak plainly, giving the audience and the cameras a raw look into what he stood for, the values he upheld, and the genuine regret he held for past actions he'd spent years atoning for. By laying his vulnerability on the line, Mark hoped to show that he was not an empty brand, but a flawed man committed to doing better, a subtle rebuke to the host's manipulative tactics. The audience, fully enraptured, offered a smattering of applause, moved by the sincerity in Mark's voice, and the host's lips tightened into a thin line, clearly displeased that his aggression hadn't provoked the public meltdown he'd been baiting for. Tension continued to coil through the studio, the host's next question poised on the tip of his tongue, but Mark beat him to the punch, pointing out how easily public discourse devolves into toxicity when the focus drifts from truth and accountability to sensationalism and spectacle. The host tried to interrupt, but Mark talked over him. An unprecedented move, raising his voice just enough to be heard without resorting to shouting, a shift that made the entire room go silent. The camera crew, sensing something monumental unfolding, zoomed in on Mark's face, capturing the unwavering determination etched into every line of his expression as he calmly and methodically dismantled the host's accusations, citing specifics, recalling dates and moments of genuine contrition, and offering undeniable evidence that his charitable acts were neither hollow nor contrived. The crowd, initially subdued in their reactions, began to stir, as though they too sensed that the balance of power was swinging away from the host's antagonistic approach. Caught off guard, the host stared at Mark in stunned silence for a moment, scrambling through his cue cards in search of a new angle to exploit. Mark seized the initiative, hammering home the point that if the host truly intended to shine a light on accountability and past mistakes, he should at least engage in a fair dialogue rather than a one-sided ambush that contributed nothing to a constructive conversation. Applause erupted from multiple sections of the audience, a clear sign they were growing tired of the host's vitriolic style, and the band drummer tapped a tension-building beat on his snare, echoing the collective heart rate that was no doubt skyrocketing in the room. Visibly flustered, the host attempted to regain dominance by pivoting to another prepared question, but his tone had lost some of its previous conviction, replaced by a hint of genuine frustration. Mark, sensing the shift, remained poised, allowing just enough space for the host to speak without relinquishing the emotional ground he had just claimed, forcing the interview dynamic to become far more equal than it had been at the outset. The air crackled with the possibility that anything could happen next. A walk-off, an explosive argument, or a rapprochement. Yet Mark's posture told everyone watching that he refused to be bullied into submission or forced into giving the shallow spectacle the host seemed so desperate to orchestrate. In that electric moment, it was clear that something had fundamentally changed, and even those behind the scenes, producers, camera operators, stagehands, watched with rapt attention, knowing that the lines had been drawn and the real confrontation had fully arrived. Mark's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but his voice stayed surprisingly steady as he insisted that acknowledging one's past is only meaningful when paired with sincere efforts to grow, and that this principle should guide anyone, whether celebrity or talk show host, who dared to judge. A pregnant silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the studio lights overhead, and the host, now forced to respond directly, cleared his throat in a moment of uncharacteristic hesitancy. Eyes darted across the audience, the teleprompter, and the control booth, indicating that the host might have just realized how deeply he'd cornered himself into an unflattering role. Before he could formulate a coherent retort, the stage manager signaled for the next commercial break, bringing a temporary ceasefire to the tense showdown and allowing both men a brief, crucial moment to collect themselves. Applause rumbled in a delayed wave through the seats, accompanied by whispers about whether Mark would endure further verbal attacks or if the host might try a different approach, aware that the audience's sympathy was increasingly leaning in Mark's favor. As the studio lights dimmed and the applause transitioned into a subdued murmur, Mark exhaled a slow breath, feeling both drained and oddly invigorated by the confrontation, and for the first time, a small glimmer of confidence flickered in his eyes. He had stood his ground and refused to cave beneath the weight of the host's hostility, proving that, while his past might be checkered, his present stance was fortified by genuine remorse, integrity, and an unwavering willingness to stand up for himself and for fair discourse. The host tapped his pen nervously against the desk, lips pressed thin as though considering the ramifications of continuing to push Mark further, fully aware that public sentiment might no longer be on his side. The production team moved about like ghosts, trying to decide if they should intervene, but none dared interrupt the electricity pulsing between the guest and the host, convinced that they were on the verge of a broadcast that would be talked about for years to come. And as the cameras cut to black for the commercial, the swirling tension refused to dissipate, leaving everyone in the studio breathless with the certainty that the true climax of this night had only just begun. As the show returned from its commercial break and the stage lights flared to life once more, Mark locked eyes with the host and felt a wave of renewed determination surge through him, a quiet conviction that finally spurred him to take full command of the moment rather than merely surviving its verbal onslaught. He straightened in his chair, and while the host resumed his line of questioning with the same pointed tone, Mark no longer waited for the host to finish or paused to offer meek rebuttals, instead raising his voice just enough to assert authority without spilling into anger. The unexpected change in Mark's demeanor startled the host, who briefly stumbled over his cue cards, losing the polished, abrasive rhythm he had kept up for most of the interview as the power dynamic in the room subtly shifted. Mark used that split second of the host's hesitation to interject his own narrative, weaving in personal anecdotes that cut straight to the core of his experiences. revealing glimpses of heartfelt struggles, professional triumphs, and all the small moments in between that had shaped him into the man he was today. He spoke of the nights he lay awake, grappling with the weight of past actions he could never undo, and the mornings he rose with a fierce determination to live each day better than the last, carrying the lessons that his toughest challenges had imparted. Murmurs from the audience indicated they were riveted by this new side of Mark, who seemed less like a polished celebrity and more like a man on a mission, someone unwilling to let half-truths twist his story any longer. The host tried to recover his position by firing another loaded question about Mark's motives for sharing so openly, insinuating that it was nothing more than a performance crafted to win sympathy points from viewers. Mark leaned forward with a steady gaze and calmly dismantled the host's accusation, explaining that authenticity, true authenticity, stemmed not from carefully orchestrated PR moves but from real pain, real growth, and the courage to speak plainly about it all in the face of relentless skepticism. A ripple of applause spread through the front row, joined by approving nods from some of the production crew, who seemed taken aback by how deftly Mark managed to maintain his composure while still speaking with force and conviction. The host, sensing his interview slipping out of his control, challenged Mark further, this time attempting to paint him as someone who had conveniently cherry-picked which parts of his life to showcase and which to conceal. Mark, unfazed, looked directly into the camera, acknowledging that yes, he chose to highlight the aspects of his journey that showed growth. Yet he made no secret of his past or its mistakes, never shying away from the reality that redemption was neither swift nor guaranteed. This transparent admission resonated deeply with the studio audience, whose faces reflected a collective empathy for a public figure willing to stand by both his history and his hard-won lessons. The lights overhead seemed to intensify, as though magnifying the gravity of Mark's words, each phrase steeped in an honesty that made the host's combative approach seem ever more hollow and contrived by comparison. The host's lips parted to deliver another interjection, but Mark cut him off politely, voice low yet firm, insisting that this interview wasn't just another promotional segment to skim the surface of sensational headlines, but rather an opportunity to examine the very real impact of choices and second chances. His statement hung in the air, reverberating in the sudden hush that enveloped the crowd, a hush broken only by a lone whistle of support from somewhere in the back of the studio. Drawing on the audience's energy, Mark continued, detailing how he had once been fueled by pride and anger, but had gradually replaced those impulses with a dedication to family, faith, and the countless charitable projects he'd thrown himself into over the years. He spoke not with the glitz of a Hollywood star touting philanthropic efforts as a resume booster, but with the raw sincerity of a man who had walked difficult roads and wanted to leave them in better condition for those who came after. The host, visibly disconcerted, made a final attempt to seize the narrative by bringing up tabloid stories that speculated on Mark's alleged arrogance and rumored conflicts with directors. But Mark didn't flinch, instead treating each anecdote with careful scrutiny. He calmly corrected timelines, cited credible sources, and displayed a thorough understanding of the events that had been spun into gossip, deflecting sensationalism with resolute clarity. Applause grew steadily louder, ignited by Mark's thorough, confident dismantling of rumors and the sense that he refused to be reduced to a caricature for the sake of entertainment. Sensing his usual tactics failing, the host's own frustration became palpable, his posture growing rigid as he tried to reassert control, only for Mark to respond with the same measured strength that had already won over much of the audience. Every new provocation was met not with a defensive retreat, but with a compelling, calm explanation of the truth, underpinned by real emotion that emerged in Mark's voice as he recounted how his family had been impacted by such endless rounds of scrutiny. He explained that it was hurtful not just for him, but for his loved ones, who often bore the brunt of rumors they had no power to dispel, a detail that highlighted the collateral damage of careless words and half-baked accusations. The audience responded with murmurs of understanding, many apparently viewing Mark in a new light, seeing a man fighting not just for his reputation, but for the dignity of those closest to him. The host attempted to retreat to more general questions, but Mark pressed forward, pulling the focus back onto the real conversation at hand. The dangerous cycle wherein the media stoked confrontations purely for spectacle, ignoring the human toll it took on all parties involved. He addressed the host directly, pointing out that while the tough questions were fair and could be part of a journalistic approach, They crossed a line when they dismissed an individual's entire journey for the sake of sensational headlines. The crowd cheered in response, a tangible shift from the earlier sense of discomfort and dread that had filled the room when the host's questions first began to turn hostile. Mark, emboldened by the audience's shift, revealed a more personal vulnerability, recounting a time he nearly walked away from the public eye entirely because the constant spotlight was magnifying his past mistakes rather than allowing him to forge ahead as a better man. He described the turmoil of feeling perpetually defined by his darkest moments, and how a pivotal conversation with a mentor had convinced him that real change only had meaning if you stood tall in the face of relentless doubt. The hush that fell over the studio this time was steeped in emotional resonance, as if everyone present could sense the genuine import of his words, far removed from the shallow banter typical of late-night talk shows. Soft sniffles could be heard from a few audience members who felt moved by Mark's raw honesty, and for once, the host seemed at a loss, unable to corral the interview back into the realm of glib sound bites and eyebrow-raising one-liners. Mark's tone remained steady but not cold, fiery yet not unhinged, delivering a crescendo of candid reflection that revealed to all watching exactly why he refused to succumb to the host's attempts at provocation. He spoke of personal accountability in a way that felt universal, reminding everyone that no one could move forward if society insisted on imprisoning people in their yesterdays without acknowledging genuine efforts to change. The applause that followed built gradually, starting with a few people in the second row and swelling outward like a wave, rippling through the entire crowd until it became a roar of appreciation for his frankness and conviction. Over the clamor, the host attempted to project his voice, but found it overshadowed by the momentum Mark's words had created, forced momentarily to sit in the awkward silence of his own diminishing authority. Mark didn't gloat or look triumphant. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with a measured calm, as though letting the magnitude of the moment settle, aware that a show of ego would reduce everything he'd just said to a petty clash. The production crew exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, recognizing this as a rare moment where a celebrity guest had taken control in a meaningful way rather than buckling under the pressure of inflammatory questions. At last, the host cleared his throat and, in a more subdued voice, tried to pivot again, but Mark held up a hand, politely but firmly, informing him that he was still finishing his point, effectively turning the tables on a man who had made a career out of interrupting and dominating his guests. The applause erupted anew, and for the first time all night, the host seemed visibly disarmed, unsure whether he could regain the upper hand or if the moment had definitively slipped beyond his control. Mark continued speaking, weaving in final thoughts about respect, growth, and empathy, pressing on how the cycle of sensationalism too often overshadowed the possibility of redemption, urging viewers and the media alike to consider how destructive that pattern could be. The crowd's energy felt electric, as if they were no longer watching a routine television segment, but an unexpectedly raw and powerful exchange that challenged them to reflect on their own complicity in consuming or perpetuating sensational stories. Applause punctuated many of Mark's statements, rising in volume with each heartfelt declaration, and as the momentum built, he glanced at the show's staff to confirm he wasn't exceeding some unwritten time limit. The stage manager motioned for him to continue, his expression one of cautious approval, signaling that Mark's commanding stance had not only captured the hearts of the viewers, but also earned the respect of those running the show behind the scenes. Taking one last deep breath, Mark wrapped up his monologue with a simple but profound insight into the power of second chances, explaining that while the past could never be erased, it also didn't have to become the sole defining feature of a person's identity. He thanked the audience for listening with open minds, then turned deliberately to the host, acknowledging his right to ask hard questions, yet highlighting that such questions carried a weight of responsibility that should never be taken lightly. The host's face colored slightly, and though he maintained a veneer of composure, the underlying discomfort was palpable, etched in the tension around his eyes and the tightness of his jaw. This final shift of power in Mark's favor felt permanent, as though the interview had crossed a threshold from which there was no return to the old dynamic of pointed attacks and defensive replies. The cameras panned over the crowd's standing ovation, capturing faces alight with admiration, awe, and perhaps a little lingering disbelief at what had just transpired on the stage. Mark simply lowered his head in gratitude, acknowledging the audience's response without any sign of gloating, embodying a humility that only served to further cement the authenticity of his words. When he glanced back at the host, he found him momentarily speechless, head bowed over his cue cards as though he were scrambling to salvage a semblance of control over the show. The applause, however, refused to die down, and the band took a cue from the crowd's energy, adding a brief, powerful flourish to underscore the emotional climax that had just unfolded before millions of viewers. The hush that finally followed was thick with reverence, a collective intake of breath that signified a shared understanding. No one watching would soon forget this night, nor would they forget how a man, once caricatured by tabloids and casual critics, had just shown them the depth of his conviction in stunning, undeniable fashion. The host, slowly regaining his composure, cleared his throat one more time but found himself short of a witty remark or a cunning segue, trapped in the aftermath of Mark's commanding response that had effectively rewritten the narrative of the entire interview. All eyes remained fixed on Mark as the show went to an unscheduled break, the production crew hastily cutting to a network bumper, leaving the audience on a note of raw suspense and simmering admiration for a Hollywood heavyweight who had just reclaimed his story in front of a live national audience. When the cameras rolled back onto the set, the tension was still palpable. Yet now a profound hush seemed to settle over everyone involved, as if the studio audience and production crew alike were preparing themselves for a long-awaited turning point in the night's drama. Mark took this brief lull as an opportunity to shift the conversation's focus away from the hostile back and forth, drawing on a deep well of candor and empathy that had been largely hidden beneath the surface tensions. He began by acknowledging his own flaws, laying bare memories of personal struggles that had shaped him far more than any triumph on a movie set or red carpet appearance ever could. The audience leaned in as he described how fame had at times magnified his insecurities, and how he'd wrestled with a potent mix of guilt and ambition that pushed him both to excel and to hide the depths of his vulnerability. With a measured voice that somehow carried a gentle undertone of regret, he addressed not just the host but everyone watching, declaring that true self-reflection often came at the price of painful honesty, a currency few people in Hollywood were willing to spend. The lights overhead, once harsh and confrontational, now seemed to illuminate Mark's face in a softer glow, as though echoing the tone of unexpected openness he was bringing to the conversation. Even the host's combative facade showed signs of cracking, his eyes darting momentarily to his producers, uncertain whether to interrupt Mark's heartfelt revelation or let it run its course. Sensing that the audience was ready for something deeper than tabloid narratives and accusatory questions, Mark took a vulnerable detour into his past, painting scenes of an unstable adolescence where the lines between right and wrong blurred in the face of peer pressure and limited opportunities. Though he had spoken about these memories before, never had he revealed them in such a heartfelt, introspective manner in front of such a large, live audience, effectively turning the antiseptic glare of studio lights into a spotlight on his innermost regrets. The host appeared disarmed by this unexpected shift, his trademark smirk replaced by a measured neutrality, almost as if he feared coming across as cruel in the wake of such raw confession. Mark admitted that it was easier at times to fixate on his public persona, the accolades, the awards, the muscular physique that cast him as a tough guy in film, than to confront the moments when he had failed those who believed in him. He spoke without a shred of self-pity, weaving humility and personal responsibility into every word, determined to illustrate that his regrets had ultimately fueled his desire to become a better man. A wave of empathy moved through the crowd, faces softening as they found themselves confronted not with a defensive actor or a smooth-talking celebrity, but rather a human being acknowledging the fears and frustrations that had once controlled him. Mark explained how the turning point came when he realized that atonement couldn't be fully measured in charity work, public apologies, or even personal success, but in the silent, daily sacrifices he made to stand by his loved ones and be the role model he once needed for himself. He recounted stories of volunteering in community centers and prisons, not for the cameras, but to listen to people who felt as trapped by their circumstances as he once had, offering genuine solidarity in place of empty platitudes. The host, for the first time, didn't jump in with a cutting remark or a skeptical aside. Instead, he appeared to be wrestling internally, perhaps reevaluating the role he'd played tonight in stoking an adversarial dynamic. Mark then touched upon a core fear that had haunted him since his early career, that he might never outrun his mistakes or the judgments of a society that sometimes prefers scandal to redemption, highlighting that anyone's darkest chapters can too easily become permanent stigmas if there's no space for mercy. The audience sat transfixed, some nodding along, others wiping away a tear or two, as Mark articulated the universal hunger for a second chance. A chance to prove that our greatest failures need not define us for eternity. By now, even the camera operators were visibly moved, angling their shots to capture the mingled expressions of reverence, intrigue, and solemn reflection etched on the faces throughout the studio. Mark's voice trembled just slightly when he recalled the heartbreak of feeling misunderstood and pigeonholed by the media. Yet he quickly balanced that confession by praising the mentors, friends, and family members who refused to give up on him when he seemed determined to sabotage his own future. He added that forgiveness, both from others and oneself, was a painstaking process that often required more courage than any physical feat or professional achievement, a statement that sent a hush through the crowd as they collectively absorbed its weight. The host, normally quick to insert a quip, remained silent, fiddling with a pen and glancing at the show's producers, uncertain whether to interrupt a moment that now felt more like a collective therapy session than a primetime talk show. This shift in atmosphere illustrated exactly how thoroughly Mark had turned the tables. No longer was he merely defending himself against pointed attacks. Instead, he was using this platform to urge viewers and critics alike to reconsider the way they interpret and label public figures based on half-truths and tabloid sensationalism. The entire set seemed transformed into a space for earnest dialogue, a place where vulnerability was not a weakness but a powerful form of engagement capable of disarming even the fiercest cynic. One brave audience member stood up and thanked Mark for his candor, creating a spontaneous ripple of applause that quickly spread across the room, as people realized they were participants in something more profound than typical late-night fare. The host, finally regaining some of his composure, cleared his throat and tried to navigate back to a familiar format by mentioning a controversial article that questioned Mark's sincerity. But his voice lacked its earlier confrontational edge, overshadowed by the authenticity Mark had radiated moments before. Mark responded calmly, acknowledging the critic's right to be skeptical while reiterating that true growth could never be fully proven or disproven by a single interview or article, but rather through consistent action over a lifetime. This reasoned, empathetic approach resonated across the studio, marking a stark contrast to the tense battle of wills that had unfolded earlier, and further cementing the sense that something genuinely transformative was happening on set. The host, visibly uneasy, attempted once again to regain the upper hand by hinting that Mark's philanthropic gestures might be orchestrated by a publicity team, but Mark had anticipated this question. He cited specific instances where he had privately donated time, money, and resources, even when it garnered little to no media attention, gently pointing out that if his aim had been mere self-promotion, he'd have done better to publicize every effort. That quiet, unwavering confidence in his own motivations left the host momentarily speechless, torn between continuing the confrontational line of questioning that had defined his persona or allowing the conversation to breathe in this new space of mutual respect. Sensing the host's internal struggle, Mark offered a gracious path forward by emphasizing that he didn't hold resentment for tough questions, but he hoped the world could learn to ask such questions responsibly, mindful of the human being at the center of every controversial narrative. A wave of applause surged forth yet again, and the host's eyes flickered with something akin to reluctant admiration, as though he recognized how deftly Mark had reshaped the interview's dynamic into something constructive and sincere. Onlookers behind the cameras exchanged glances that conveyed both surprise and appreciation, aware that they were witnessing a rare occurrence. A celebrity guest taking a confrontational platform and harnessing it to foster insight rather than escalate conflict. Mark's composure and transparent humility seemed to invite a collective introspection, inspiring even the show's rowdier fans to reflect on how easily public figures can be dehumanized by sensationalism. The lights overhead glowed with a welcoming warmth, as if matching the emotional temperature of the conversation, shining down on Mark's calm expression that betrayed no trace of smug victory or self-righteousness. Instead, he looked almost relieved, as though finally exhaling after years of compressed tension, realizing that by exposing his raw humanity, he had effectively freed himself from the burden of incessant posturing. Noticing this subtle transformation, The host briefly attempted to joke about the seriousness of the conversation, but the remark fell flat, drawing only polite, half-hearted chuckles from a crowd, still captivated by Mark's willingness to forego the easy route of show business glitz in favor of heartfelt self-disclosure. Mark gently acknowledged the moment's gravity, suggesting that the entertainment industry might benefit from more genuine exchanges like this, where audiences could see beyond image and marketing to the nuanced individuals behind them. This reflection triggered an enthusiastic round of applause, and a faint smile tugged at Mark's lips, hinting that he recognized he'd found common ground with the crowd, forming a shared desire for authenticity over spectacle. The host, cornered by the weight of Mark's sincerity, made a final effort to retake control by referencing a gossip website's rumor about Mark's alleged controlling nature on set, but the assertion felt hollow, lacking the sting it might have carried earlier in the night. With unwavering calm, Mark explained that every major production required a strong guiding hand to ensure everyone pulled together, but he stressed that he never used his influence to belittle or diminish anyone else, pointing to testimonies from cast and crew who praised his leadership style. The crowd responded warmly, further eroding the host's attempts to cast Mark in a negative light, and forcing him to finally concede, albeit silently, that he might have chosen the wrong strategy by focusing so heavily on personal attacks. Surrounded by a roomful of people whose expressions ranged from empathy to outright admiration, Mark took a moment to breathe in the charged air, sensing that this was the perfect time to deliver a closing thought on the power of vulnerability. He spoke about how true courage lay not in posturing or deflection, but in laying one's mistakes out for all to see, with the faith that personal growth could overshadow even the darkest of histories. His words elicited an enthusiastic standing ovation from a large segment of the audience, complete with cheers and the occasional whistle, a stark reversal from the earlier tension when he had first stepped onto the stage under a cloud of suspicion. Pausing in the middle of that applause, Mark turned to the host with an earnest gaze, silently offering him a moment of shared humanity rather than triumph. The host, still processing this whirlwind transformation, met Mark's eyes and managed a nod, neither a complete surrender nor a continuation of his previous hostility, but rather a reluctant acknowledgement that he had witnessed something genuinely powerful. Cameras seized that fleeting second, two men, once locked in battle, now sharing a tenuous truce forged by unexpected empathy, an image that would undoubtedly become the defining moment of the night. Mark gave a reserved bow of his head to the audience, visibly moved by their response, and then settled back into his seat, heart pounding but steady, confident that he had left nothing unsaid. The stage manager signaled for another brief station break, the overhead lights dimming as the band's gentle instrumental accompanied a crowd still buzzing from the emotional revelations. In the darkness, Mark exhaled slowly, feeling something akin to serenity wash over him, aware that he had taken the biggest risk of all by unveiling his vulnerability and had emerged stronger for it. Crew members whispered among themselves about how this segment might become a defining highlight not just of the season, but of the show's entire history, a testament to the idea that real conversations could still happen on national television. Meanwhile, the host sat quietly, leafing through his cue cards as though they were relics of a script no longer relevant in the current atmosphere, wrestling with the realization that tonight had not gone as he'd planned, yet might prove infinitely more meaningful. And so, in the hush that enveloped the studio before the lights would flare back on, Mark's transformation stood as a beacon of what could be achieved when honesty triumphed over spectacle, inviting everyone watching to wonder if perhaps we all had the capacity for a similar moment of clarity. The next morning, as news outlets across the country replayed footage of Mark's astonishing confrontation and candid reflections, the interview began to take on a life of its own, sparking fervent discussions on social media, talk radio, and primetime news segments that dissected every nuance of what had transpired live on air. People praised Mark for standing his ground and unveiling his humanity in an environment typically governed by sensational headlines. And even those who once harbored skeptical views about his sincerity found themselves rethinking their assumptions after seeing his raw display of honesty. Network executives, initially braced for a potential public relations nightmare, instead discovered that the ratings for the show had soared beyond their wildest expectations, prompting internal debates about whether they should continue cultivating drama or pivot toward more meaningful, in-depth dialogues. As these discussions raged on behind the scenes, Mark himself felt a curious blend of relief and apprehension, aware that while the night's events had won him new supporters, it had also shone an unrelenting spotlight on his personal life in ways he couldn't fully control. In interviews conducted in the days that followed, Mark exhibited a gracious but measured tone, choosing neither to demonize the host nor to pretend the confrontation never happened, instead framing it as a necessary turning point that underscored broader issues around how the media exploits vulnerability. Paparazzi trailed him whenever he ventured out in public, capturing glimpses of his interactions with fans and family members. And these candid photos often revealed a man caught between the desire for privacy and the obligation to stand by the statements he had made so openly. A late-night poll circulated online, asking viewers whether they felt Mark had proven himself a changed man, and the overwhelming response was positive, with many praising the actor for shedding the superficial veneer so pervasive in Hollywood's press circuit. Support from other prominent figures in the entertainment industry poured in, with actors, directors, and even studio heads lauding Mark's ability to conduct himself with dignity under fire, arguing that his willingness to be vulnerable set a new standard for authenticity. The show's host, meanwhile, found himself facing uncharacteristic pushback from viewers who accused him of unprofessional conduct, calling into question the ethics of prying into sensitive aspects of a guest's life purely for entertainment value. Commentators who typically reveled in celebrity feuds and scandals took a step back to reevaluate how easily a talk show environment could devolve into an ambush when the lines between tough questioning and personal vendetta blurred beyond recognition. For a brief window of time, the conversation extended far beyond Mark himself, igniting debates about the media's role in either perpetuating hostility or fostering genuine dialogue, and some journalists even admitted to reconsidering their own methods of reporting. Mark, never one to rest on public sentiment alone, quietly expanded his charitable efforts, directing funds toward organizations dedicated to rehabilitation and community outreach, a gesture that sparked renewed interest in his philanthropic record. Industry insiders whispered about how Mark's shift from a stoic, often typecast figure into an advocate for honest reflection might open doors for new kinds of roles, and several top-tier directors reportedly contacted his agent with scripts that promised more nuanced, character-driven stories. At home, Mark grappled with a bittersweet sense of vindication, recalling how the very experiences he once thought would define him negatively had, in fact, armed him with a unique perspective that now resonated powerfully with countless individuals across the country. There was a sense that the night on which he'd confronted the host had served as a catalyst for an entire cultural flashpoint, prompting viewers to examine their own relationships with criticism, forgiveness, and the relentless pursuit of tabloid drama. Parents who had watched the interview with their teenagers wrote letters to Mark, expressing their gratitude for his frank discussion of mistakes, second chances, and the importance of character, citing how it opened up valuable conversations in their homes. Online forums buzzed with debates about whether Mark's story could encourage others with troubled pasts to step forward and reclaim their narrative, shedding the shame that so often overshadowed meaningful redemption arcs. The host, unaccustomed to being on the defensive, issued a carefully worded statement that attempted to reconcile the public's backlash with his self-styled brand of bold journalism, though his usual arrogance had been tempered by a wave of criticism he never anticipated. Media outlets pounced on the statement, analyzing every phrase for signs of contrition or continued hostility, and while some sided with him, pointing out that tough interviews were part of public life, many felt he had overstepped his bounds. In the midst of these swirling commentaries, Mark maintained a poised silence about the host, choosing to let his actions and his newly revealed humility speak louder than any retaliatory jabs could have done. Still, during a rare moment of introspection, he confessed to a close friend that his biggest takeaway from the experience was the realization that no single interview, no matter how explosive, could fully encapsulate a person's journey or the depths of their atonement. The show, buoyed by sky-high ratings, saw an uptick in the number of serious guests willing to appear, hoping to spark similarly honest exchanges, although many were quick to request assurances that they wouldn't be subjected to the same line of ambush questioning. Some critics noted that the very tension Mark had braved might now allow for deeper conversations in a medium so often reduced to fluff and promotional soundbites, inadvertently crediting him with steering the landscape toward a more earnest form of televised discourse. Meanwhile, talk of possible award nominations for Mark's upcoming film gained fresh traction, his performance gaining new layers of intrigue for viewers curious about how real-life vulnerability might inform his next on-screen portrayal. The tabloids, too, adjusted their narrative, replacing scandalous headlines with stories of a reformed star who had outgrown his old mistakes, inadvertently granting Mark a level of public empathy he'd rarely experienced before. Occasionally, a few voices insisted that this redemption arc was just another PR strategy. Yet their skepticism seemed dwarfed by the flood of support from those who had been touched by Mark's authenticity on that fateful night. Mark's co-stars and friends unanimously echoed the sentiment that he had embarked on a new chapter of his personal and professional life, one in which the complexities of his past no longer had to be suppressed or sensationalized, but instead acknowledged as stepping stones to growth. Even the host's longtime fans admitted they found themselves torn, many staying loyal to his provocative style but simultaneously unable to dismiss the validity of Mark's message, thus giving rise to lively debates about the fine line between controversy and constructive dialogue. Mark himself found that in the days following the interview, his inbox overflowed with invitations to speak at youth centers, schools, and charity events, including heartfelt requests from communities that saw parallels between his story and their own struggles with stigmatization. Late at night, when he reflected on the tumultuous whirlwind of events, he felt both drained and oddly uplifted, aware that his decision to confront the host had triggered a groundswell of conversation that transcended mere gossip. Casting directors he'd never worked with before began to reach out, intrigued by how fully Mark had stepped into a role that demanded emotional courage, even though it played out in real life rather than on a movie screen. Articles about the Wahlberg moment circulated online, defining it as that rare instance when celebrity image bowed before genuine human connection, and ironically, the confrontation's sensational start had blossomed into something more akin to a public healing session. Quietly, Mark continued to juggle the responsibilities of fatherhood, filming commitments, and personal reflection, finding solace in the knowledge that sharing his truth had connected him to an audience that extended far beyond box office numbers. The host, feeling compelled to defend his reputation, tentatively reached out to Mark's team about the possibility of a follow-up interview, perhaps in a more controlled, less contentious setting, though speculation continued as to whether Mark would consider it. A few anchors on competing networks mused that the original show might be permanently altered, challenged to rethink its approach to interviews by a guest who'd proven that substance and confrontation need not be mutually exclusive. Bloggers and cultural commentators further explored the broader social implications, suggesting that if Mark's story could gain widespread acceptance, maybe countless others burdened by their pasts could find the courage to step forward, confront their mistakes, and chart new paths. It became increasingly clear that the host had misjudged Mark's capacity for both self-awareness and moral conviction, realizing too late that the usual sensational formula didn't apply to someone whose honesty was as disarming as it was unwavering. Even some of the host's own staff admitted privately that the interview had taught them a lesson about empathy versus spectacle, prompting discussions about implementing guidelines to prevent future segments from devolving into such blatant ambush tactics. Mark, for his part, grew less interested in the fervor surrounding his name and more dedicated to ensuring his newfound momentum fueled something bigger than a personal rebranding, redirecting any heightened media interest toward the causes he believed in. As he watched footage of the show replayed in montage form on the evening news, he felt a strange surge of gratitude for a confrontation he had initially dreaded, recognizing it as the crucible in which his convictions had been sharpened. The story continued to morph over time, distilling itself into a modern-day parable of how one courageous stand could spark a wave of reflection, pushing viewers, reporters, and the entertainment machine itself to reevaluate the way they judge and forgive. Mark's phone buzzed incessantly with messages of encouragement from old friends, newfound admirers, and even a handful of critics who appreciated that he had faced scrutiny head-on instead of hiding behind handlers or PR statements. Conferences, film festivals, and award shows invited him to speak or present, no longer simply for star power but to share insights on resilience, accountability, and the intricate relationship between celebrity and truth. Some cynics griped that the ordeal had catapulted Mark into an almost saint-like status in the public eye, but the overwhelming counterpoint remained that people didn't expect saints. They just craved authenticity in a culture starving for it. Rather than letting these varied responses disorient him, Mark embraced the complexity, recognizing that true change was never solely about personal triumph, but also about challenging others to question the narratives they eagerly consumed. Ultimately, the host's show, for all its controversy, became the unwitting platform for a watershed moment in public discourse, and Mark Wahlberg emerged as the figure through whom countless viewers gained a renewed appreciation for the power of accountability and redemption. Critics would later mark that particular interview as a cultural turning point, a moment where a high-profile figure turned a potential train wreck into an exercise in empathy, sparking conversations still reverberating within the industry years later. And while Mark's journey would continue with the usual ups and downs of any prominent career, the resonance of that night, his ability to stand tall, speak truth, and move hearts, solidified his place not just as a Hollywood star, but as a man whose courage and vulnerability left an indelible mark on the public conscience.